around this time of the year, what we do at all the Crossbridge campuses is we remind ourselves of why we are here. Why does our church exist? Why does Crossbridge exist? Why are you part of Crossbridge? Every year, we come and we remind ourselves of that. You know, if you've been at Crossbridge for any number of years, this campaign that we do each year is called Making Our House a Home. This year, because this is our 15th year anniversary, and we've been here in Miami for a decade and a half, we're calling just this year this campaign and this series of sermons entitled Gospel Legacy. Why are we here? We are here to build a legacy together. That's why we're here. And this legacy is a gospel legacy. And to remind us of that, of this purpose, of why we exist, which is to leave a legacy behind. It's a gospel legacy. We're going to go to the Word of God. This is not an idea that has come out of my mind. This is not an idea that has come out of the elders' minds or the other pastors' minds. This is an idea that has come out of Jesus, that was passed on to his disciples. And through the centuries and through the years, the followers of Jesus have always passed it down to the following disciples, to the next generation of disciples. Why are we here? To leave together a gospel legacy. This is what we read in the scriptures. I want to invite you to go to the book of Romans. This is a letter written by one of the apostles of Jesus, a man by the name of the Apostle Paul. He writes this to Christians that lived in Rome at the time. And this is the letter that will help us to guide and remind us of our purpose as a church. So we're going to read today from Romans 1. We're going to read verses 8 through verses 17. So will you follow along with me? First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all of the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. This is the word of the Lord. What is this legacy about? It's about the gospel. We're going to look into that. Why is our legacy a gospel legacy that we're leaving behind? Secondly, I want us to ask the question, why does it have to be a gospel legacy that as a church we ought to leave behind? And then lastly, how can you partake in this legacy as well? First, it's about the gospel. It really is about the gospel. What is the gospel? You know, at least 3 times we read the word gospel here in the verses that we read. The gospel is a translation from the Greek word evangelion. Now, if you speak either Spanish or Portuguese or French, it's easy for you to understand what evangelion means, because that's the word that would appear in your native tongue's Bible version. But when you go to the Greek, evangelion means you, new. In angelos, it means herald, or it means news. It means message. See, angels, that's where we get the word angels, angelos. Angels are nothing more than messengers from God. So, evangelion, new, herald message, a new message. This term was used back in those days for when something that happened and took place had a transformative effect in people's lives. They don't necessarily need to be a part of it. They necessarily didn't have to cause what has taken place, but because it has taken place, it affected everyone's life. Now, if you've lived for the past few decades, this has taken place in our own lifetime as well. I think about my own lifetime, and some of the good news or the good heralding that I have heard in the last several decades of my life that have profoundly changed my life. I can think about 3 of them, for instance. Number 1, when they told me, you don't have to write physical letters anymore and wait 7 days for it to arrive. Okay? You can write emails. I mean, some of you know that Beth and I, when we were dating, that's what we did. We wrote letters, and it would take 7 days for these letters to arrive. You don't have to do that anymore. There's this thing called email. It's instant. Secondly, that you don't have to leave your house to shop. Amazon delivered right at your door. You don't have, this is good. Really? Yeah, good news. The last one, hey, you don't have to spend 10 hours preparing a sermon anymore. There's this thing called ChatGPT. Okay, I have resisted ChatGPT, and my sermons do not come from ChatGPT. At least currently they don't. It's a byproduct of a lot of prayer and Bible reflection, okay? But maybe one day. You never know. You never know. That's what good news is. I did not work to create the internet or the emails. I did not invent Amazon, although the inventor is going to be our neighbor pretty soon. I did not invent artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, but someone did, and because of someone's action, it's become good news to me, and it has changed my life and your life as well. When the Apostle Paul says the gospel of Jesus, what he's saying, something has happened a few years ago in history. It was a life-altering event. It has changed your life because it has happened. You did not participate, you did not contribute to it, but it has happened, and it is good news. You don't have to save yourself anymore. You don't have to work hard to get God's approval and God's attention. Someone has done that on your behalf already. That's good news, the gospel of Jesus. That's what the gospel is. And here at Crossbridge, we are not here trying to leave a legacy for people that is about our church. I could care less than that if in a decade from now, 2 decades from now, people will say, oh, well, look at the impact that Crossbridge has made in my life. What I'm really after, what we are really after, what I really want to hear in the future is, I came to Crossbridge, but I heard the gospel. I was impacted by the gospel. The gospel has profoundly changed my life. And the reason for that is that everything in life is transient. We live in the most transient city. And this island is one of the most transient areas of this city, that people are always coming and going. I feel like every week I'm saying hello and goodbye to people here in Miami, and especially here in Key Biscayne. It's a very transient area. It's a very transient city. And you are therefore transient, and churches, local churches are transient. You know, there are some churches that did great good in the past and they're no longer around. The 7 churches of Revelation that we read about in the book of Revelation, they're no longer there, those churches, even though they had a great impact in the society and the culture and the world of their days. They're no longer around. But even though they're no longer around, they've left a legacy that was passed on that has come to us here today, which is the gospel. The gospel is the legacy that we want to leave behind. And you've watched this video prior to the sermon of all these people that have experienced the power of the gospel here in our church because we have made this our mission to leave a gospel legacy behind. And if people are to come here and move somewhere else, that they will at least take that which is most important, which is the gospel. I recently had a testimony that was shared to me of someone that attended one of our campuses. I don't know if you knew this, but Crossbridge is composed of 5 locations here in Miami, and we have one in São Paulo as well. And all this has happened in the last 15 years. But I got this testimonial from a young man who came to Miami to work on a graduate degree, to med school, and he spent some time here. And he obviously, when he graduated from med school, he was placed somewhere else to do his residency. And he wrote us this. This is his words. Okay, his name is Rodrigo. He's a Mexican exchange student that came to Miami. He says, "Since I was 14 years old, I had been agnostic. This was in large part because of how, at that point, I had become very evidence-based and decided I did not want to believe in God just because I was told to. I felt like I would get a benefit from heaven, in parentheses, felt it was easier than not believing in a God, or felt like I just needed someone to get me through hard situations. Instead, I wanted to feel that my faith was based on reasoning and that I was justified. Like many others, I'd also become disillusioned in the church and how some of its followers represent it, but not all. After my wife, Danny, came to faith in Jesus, I started going to Crossbridge with her to be supportive, but slowly started to enjoy it myself. Through time, I felt like we were part of a community that was focused on the teachings of Jesus, how to bring them into the world, and most importantly, on his message of love without judgment. I was comforted being in a community that did not condemn doubt and actually encouraged asking questions. It truly felt that I could belong. While this did not convince me to believe, it was what opened my mind to faith again. My doubts about believing again began ironically while reading a book on philosophy that covered parts of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Smart guy. I agreed with most of the arguments he made against the classic Christian apologist arguments, but this led me to look for counter-arguments due to curiosity. I ended up reading about other strong arguments in favor and scholarly research into the historicity of Jesus outside of the Bible. A few months passed, and I slowly noticed how when I had my eyes open to him, I was seeing him left and right. This led me to read C.S. Lewis, wrestle through questions, meeting up with my campus pastor for coffee, reading books he recommended, and praying. I may not have everything figured out, but I am now committed to know and to follow Jesus. He's no longer here among us, but the gospel legacy is following him wherever he is at. That's what we are after. Everything else in this life is transient, but the gospel will remain forever. The gospel is the only permanent thing. And Jesus said that in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And so that is the reason why the Apostle Paul writes here in verse 16, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus." What the Apostle Paul means by making this statement is to say, I am fully confident in the gospel. I know that the gospel is offensive to people, to Jews who are religious and to the Greeks, but I don't care. I will continue to live my life, he says here, to proclaim the gospel because I trust in the power that the gospel has to change. And it's because of that Crossbridge has its first core value as being a cross-focused church because the cross is the ultimate message of the gospel. We are a church that's all about the gospel. Every Sunday that you come here, you are not going to hear good advice. You're going to hear good news. Because the gospel is not good advice. The gospel is good news. And if you're going to be part of Crossbridge, you have to hold that same commitment to the good news of the gospel, because at the end of the day, even though good advice is important, but what people really, really need is good news. It's all about the gospel. Now, why should we make it all about the gospel? Because, number one, the gospel is power. The gospel is power. If you go back to verse 16, you will read this. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes. The gospel is power. When you go into the Greek, which was the original language that the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, do you know what the word power there is? Dynamis. Power, dynamis. From where we get the word dynamite. Let's think about this just for a little bit. The gospel is dynamite. High-powered explosives have the potential to change complete landscapes for the worse or for the better. Our minds have been, in the recent months, filled with landscapes that have been negatively changed by the power of high-powered explosives. But when you go from here to another state on a road trip, those roads that give you access were also created by the power of explosives. You can build tunnels, you can build roads, you can tear down old buildings and clear the ground for new and modern edifications that would give more purpose to the community where these new buildings are inserted. High-power explosives, they can change the landscape and the environment. I remember when I moved to Miami over 15 years ago with the mission of starting Crossbridge from scratch. We didn't have 5 churches, we had 0. One of the things that I've sensed when I got here, the first few months, was the darkness of the city. Now, it's interesting because Miami is a bright city. We have a lot of sunlight. People dressed in colors. Sometimes they don't dress at all. Flashy cars, colors everywhere, buildings, in the buildings, everywhere. Excitement, parties, music, beach. But the contrast, the colorful and light-filled surface, underneath it all, there is an environment of darkness. I felt the darkness in the city. It's no wonder that Miami is one of the most unchurched cities in the country. It is one of the hardest cities to start churches and to do gospel work. It is a very dark spiritual city. And I remember in those very early days thinking to myself, how am I going to get over this first step, let alone the rest of the mission? And my prayer to God in the days that were really discouraging in the city, in this dark climate of a city, was to pray to God, God, change the landscape. Change the spiritual landscape of the city. And I also pray to God, God, will you use us to play a tiny role in changing the landscape, the spiritual landscape of the city, the spiritual landscape of these neighborhoods. And what I always heard back from God is, if you're faithful to the gospel, things will happen. Because the gospel is power. The gospel is the only hope for our city. The gospel is the only hope for our world. The gospel is the only hope for people's lives. The gospel is the only hope for your marriage. The gospel is the only hope for your children. The gospel is the power of God. And through the years, I have been profoundly encouraged by that. Not only by the power of the gospel, but the hope that the gospel has to offer. And the stories of life transformation that we have heard across the city through all the campuses. It's deeply encouraging to me, for instance, here at Key Biscayne, that most of our leaders were leaders that have found and experienced the gospel at our church. That many of you who are here have found and experienced the life-transforming power of the gospel of Jesus. At Crossbridge, we have our share of church transfers. See, churches can grow in two ways. They can grow through transfers or conversions. What are transfers? Somebody that's going to one church, a Baptist church, and then you have a better program, a better band, a better worship, a better preacher. They're like, oh, I can consume better over there, right? So there's a lot of churches that grow through transfer, but you can also grow through conversions. People that were unchurched, people that did not know Jesus and know the gospel, who have come to faith in Jesus through the gospel. So we do have our share of transfers, but a lot of the growth of Crossbridge, especially in our younger campuses, have been through conversions, through people that have found the gospel here. I'm looking at this room, I see several of you. Through conversion, new life in Christ. I have a picture here of the many baptisms. We have an average across the campuses in Miami of experiencing, of hearing stories of about 100 conversions a year. Isn't that amazing? I think that's amazing. Now, not everyone stays here because we know the transiency of our city, but what we're doing here is we're heralding the gospel. We live for the sake of the gospel. That's why we exist, because the gospel has power and it offers hope to people. Now, this letter is interesting because if you continue to read the following verses from verse 18 onward, the Apostle Paul gives a picture of the state of the world. The state of the world of his days, which when you read, it's like, well, this sounds like our modern day society. This is what he says. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, he says, we live in a society where people do not acknowledge God. God gave them up to a debased mind to do what they thought they ought to, but not to be done. And they were filled with all manners of unrighteousness and evil and covetousness and malice and full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossipers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. This is the state of his world. And you're like, oh, this is the state of our world too. But listen, the Apostle Paul writes this not to discourage them, but to say, hey, even though this is the world in which we live in, there is hope because the gospel is at work through you. It's through us. There's hope. The gospel is forming a very unique community. One of the things that I love the most about Crossbridge because I travel around and preach at the different campuses on a Sunday, and on a Sunday basis, I guarantee you this, I hear Spanish being spoken in our hallways and rooms, Portuguese for sure here, Mandarin, and even English. And this just represents the type of community that the gospel has the power to form, because people that will not naturally hang out there, because of the gospel, they have found a family in common. Regardless of their race, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of how they vote, regardless of their religious background, the gospel has the power to form this unique community. And we're seeing this happen here at Crossbridge. Which leads me to the last part of our sermon, that is, how can you partake in this legacy? Number one, it's very clear here, you must believe the gospel. He says that the gospel is the power to save anyone who believes in it. And here's what I want you to understand. You cannot give that which you do not have. You cannot extend good news if you haven't been partaker of good news. How can you say to people, hey, you should try Amazon if you've never tried it before? And so a prerogative for partaking in building this legacy together with us is to experience the gospel, to know the gospel of Jesus Christ, to be a reality in your life. The campaign that we launch every year here to get you to give more of your time, your talents, and your treasure to the mission of Crossbridge, which is to leave a gospel legacy, is not for anyone that has not experienced the gospel. In fact, if you're here today and you say, I haven't experienced this in my life yet, it is not for you. But if you have, how could you not be excited about joining this mission? You must believe the gospel. Now you're asking the question, what does it mean to believe the gospel? Look at verse 17. Verse 17 is the key verse here. As we're driving everything home through verse 17. He says, for it is in the righteousness of God. For the righteous in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith alone. It is in the righteousness of God, revealed from faith to faith, which is written, the righteous shall live by faith. This word righteousness that appears here in the Bible really means a good standing, to have a good standing. And the truth of the matter is that everyone here in this room, we're working for a good standing. We want the people around us, our co-workers, we want our neighbors, we want our friends, we want our family members to do this to us. Great job. You matter. You have a good standing among us. And because all of us are longing to be loved and accepted, that's all of you here, okay? All of us. The way in which we are building this righteousness, which is our good standing with others, some of us are doing that through work. Some of us are doing that through image, trying to look the best we can before others. Some of us are doing that through good deeds and good works, serving others so that people will be impressed and, oh man, you matter. The Apostle Paul, who is writing this, was a man that before he became a follower of Jesus, before he had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, he was also engaged in this enterprise, this personal enterprise, to build a righteousness that was based on morality. By being a religious man and defending his own faith against the Christianity that was poisoning his community. And so he persecuted Christians until he had an encounter with Jesus, and he said, all of that works of righteousness that I was engaged in the past is now considered rubbish to me. He actually uses a four-letter word in Greek. I'm not going to repeat it, but that's what the original word is. I consider rubbish compared to knowing Jesus. What the gospel tells us is this, is that all different forms of righteousness, every effort that you put into building a good standing so that you would receive approval and love from people and from God, all of these things, all of the righteousness that you can build will one day blow away. One day you're going to have to stop working. One day money will run out, especially if an economic crisis comes and takes place. Everything is subject to change. Everything can be blown away and taken by the winds of life. Your image, you're going to get old. Doesn't matter how much Botox you put on your face. You're going to have to come with a magnum bottle of Botox one day to squeeze it in your face, and it's not going to be enough. You're going to lose the battle because everything in this life is fleeting. All forms of righteousness, they will be blown away except for the righteousness that you can receive as a gift from God in Jesus. All other righteousness are achieved. This is the only one that is received. And when you realize that all the efforts that you're doing to find a good standing between people and God are not enough, and it's fleeting, it's going to go away, and you take that and you exchange it for the righteousness that can be given to you by God as a gift through Jesus because of what he has done, that profoundly changes your life. You move into life with an amazing sense of humility and confidence at the same time that no one has. That's how you experience the gospel. And when you do, this is what happens. And Paul talks about this. And this is what our partnership here looks like. First, the Apostle Paul says in verse 8 and 9, actually verses 9, he says, for God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers. You will have a life of prayer. You will pray for the gospel to advance into people's lives. We invite you during the season to pray that more of the people of Key Biscayne and Miami will get to know Jesus through the ministry of our church. Do you spend time praying for that? We invite you to pray. The Apostle Paul is saying, because I have believed the gospel, all who believe the gospel would love to see other people come to faith. And the first way you do that is through prayer. We invite you to pray so that God would move in the hearts of people. Then he continues on, and he says in verse 11, for I long to see you. Why does Paul long to see them? That I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. Generosity is the second thing that flows out of a deep understanding of the gospel, being generous. Paul's saying, I want to impart some gifts so that you can continue to grow. What we do is when we experience the gospel, we learn that Jesus gave to us much more than we can ever give back to him. And because he gave radically to us, we make sure that we respond to that by giving more and in a radical way of our time, our talents, and our treasure so that other people will experience the gospel. You want the gospel to advance? Pray. But you really, really want it to advance? Give. Be generous with it. We are passing out these pledge cards today, and we are asking you to fill them out and to prayerfully consider how the Lord wants to use you in the life of our church in the coming year. This helps our team to budget ministry. This helps our team to budget volunteers. So will you take this and will you prayerfully consider and take a step and fill it out and give it back to us? You can give it back by putting in the offering plates, or there's a giving box there in the back. You can fill it out, you can fold it, you can put it there. If you need an envelope, we have envelopes in the table there in the back. You can put it inside an envelope. If you're not ready to turn them in today, take them home, pray, and bring them back next week. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about this. Because at the end of the day, the Apostle Paul recognizes, right, in verse 12, that this is a way where we mutually encourage each other's faith. It's a partnership. What we understand here at Crossbridge is that we can't accomplish this mission of leaving a gospel legacy in the lives of people that would transform people's lives by ourselves. It's our effort together. It is our partnership in the gospel. I'd like you to imagine many years from now hearing the stories, more stories of people that have had life-transforming experiences because the gospel was preached here, was lived out here, and you get to say, I was part of that. I want you to imagine billions of years from now around the throne of grace with Jesus in all of eternity, and people said, hey, because you invested your gifts, because you invested your time in my life, because you invested certain resources in my life, I'm here today with you around the throne. This is an investment that will last into all eternity. Let's build this legacy together.